What if I told you there's a country in Africa that was never colonized? A place where kings claimed blood from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. A land so ancient, some say it's where humanity itself was born. This isn't fiction. This is Ethiopia, the empire that defied empires. From giant stone obelisks carved 2,000 years ago, to a battle where Africans crushed a European army. From biblical legends to modern revolutions, Ethiopia's history is more powerful, more dramatic, and more real than any movie you've seen. And yet, most people have no idea how deep this story goes. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll see why Ethiopia isn't just another country. It's the soul of Africa, and maybe the place where we all came from. Cradle of Humanity, the prehistoric origins of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is not just another ancient land. It is a time capsule, one that has preserved the earliest whispers of humanity. Before we even speak of kings, empires, and battles, we must begin at the very dawn of human existence. The story of Ethiopia begins over 3 million years ago, in a world vastly different from our own, where forests and grasslands stretched endlessly across what we now call East Africa. It is here, in the Great Rift Valley, that some of the earliest ancestors of humanity took their first steps. And not just anywhere, but in Ethiopia itself. In 1974, near the village of Hadar in the Afar region of Ethiopia, paleoanthropologist Donald Johanson and his team discovered a skeleton that would change the course of our understanding of human origins. She was small, only about 3.5 feet tall, and around 3.2 million years old. They named her Lucy. But to the world of science, she became Australopithecus afarensis, a species that walked upright and is believed to be one of the direct ancestors of modern humans. Lucy was not alone. In the decades since, the Ethiopian landscape has yielded dozens of ancient hominid fossils. Among the most remarkable was Arti, short for Ardipithecus ramidus, discovered in 1994 in the Middle Awash region. Arti predates Lucy by over 1 million years, estimated to be about 4.4 million years old. She walked on 2 legs, but also climbed trees, a fascinating transitional form between earlier primates and hominins. These discoveries positioned Ethiopia as one of the most important archaeological sites in the world, a literal cradle of humanity. No other place on Earth has provided such a deep, rich fossil record stretching so far back into human prehistory. It's not just a national heritage, it's a global one. But what made Ethiopia such a significant region for early hominids? Geography played a critical role. The Great Rift Valley, which slices through Ethiopia, is a tectonic boundary where the African plate is slowly splitting. This constant geological activity exposed ancient layers of Earth, preserving fossils and sediments for millions of years. Furthermore, the varied ecosystems, from forests and highlands to river valleys, offered early humans the resources they needed to adapt, migrate, and evolve. As we move from prehistory into early human history, we find Ethiopia once again at the center. Around 10,000 years ago, during the Neolithic period, people in the Ethiopian highlands began practicing agriculture. Long before the Nile Valley civilizations reached their peak, communities in Ethiopia were cultivating teff, a hearty grain still essential to Ethiopian cuisine today. They also domesticated animals, developed stone tools, and formed some of the earliest sedentary societies in Africa. Around the 5th millennium BCE, signs of complex social organization began to emerge. Rock art found in various parts of the country, notably in Harar and Tigray, shows human figures, cattle, and symbols that suggest ritual or social significance. These were not just isolated tribes. They were the seeds of a civilization. By around 1000 BCE, Ethiopia had developed trade networks with the Arabian Peninsula and the Nile Valley. The Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, lined to Ethiopia's east, offered vital maritime routes. It's believed that the ancient peoples of Ethiopia were in contact with the Sabaeans of southern Arabia, a civilization known for their incense trade and monumental architecture. This period also gave rise to one of Ethiopia's mysterious and largely undocumented early civilizations, the Kingdom of DMT, located in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. Flourishing around the 10th to 5th centuries BCE, DMT is considered by many to be Ethiopia's first political entity. Though much remains unclear due to limited archaeological evidence, the capital city of Yeha still stands today, with massive stone ruins and a remarkable temple that bears clear South Arabian architectural influences. The Kingdom of DMT is often thought of as a bridge between the prehistoric world of hunter-gatherers and pastoralists and the later, more centralized empires like Aksum. Its language, religion, and writing system, the Sabaic script, show a blend of African and Arabian cultures, a testament to Ethiopia's long-standing role as a cultural crossroads. By this time, Ethiopia was no longer just a site of human origins. It was an emerging player in the world of early civilizations. But while contact with Arabia influenced the highland peoples of Ethiopia, the core of their identity remained uniquely African. The people adapted outside technologies, but reshaped them to fit their local traditions, beliefs, and social structures. This ability to synthesize foreign influence while preserving local identity became a recurring pattern in Ethiopian history. As we move closer to the turn of the Common Era, Ethiopia was on the verge of something much greater. Trade intensified across the Red Sea. Inland, new power centers began to rise. And then around the 1st century CE, a kingdom emerged that would not only dominate the region, but also leave a lasting legacy in African, Middle Eastern, and even European history, the Kingdom of Aksum. But before we arrive there, we must recognize what makes Ethiopia's earliest chapters so powerful. Unlike other nations whose ancient roots are wrapped in mythology, Ethiopia's roots are carved into the very bones of human evolution. It is not just the land of origins, as its tourism slogan claims. It is the land where walking upright began, where society took shape, and where the journey of humanity itself began. This early period lays the foundation for everything that follows. The kingdoms, the empires, the faiths, the conflicts, they all rest upon this ancient soil, soaked with millions of years of history. The very ground underfoot tells stories older than writing, older than memory, stories that connect all of us, no matter where we come from. And as we move forward in time, into the age of Aksum, of kings and queens, of conquest and conversion, we carry with us the echoes of Lucy, Ardi, and the first human footprints ever made. The rise of Aksum, Ethiopia's golden age, begins. As the echoes of prehistory faded into the rhythm of settled life, Ethiopia stood on the edge of transformation. From the ancient roots in DMT and scattered highland chiefdoms, a new force began to rise, one that would define Ethiopia for centuries to come. Around the 1st century CE, in the northern highlands of modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, the Kingdom of Aksum emerged. It was not born in isolation. Aksum rose from the fertile crescent of trade, culture, and diplomacy that linked Africa to Arabia, Persia, India, and the Roman world. Its capital, also called Aksum, quickly became a beacon of wealth and power. The kingdom's strategic position near the Red Sea was crucial. From the port city of Adulis, goods flowed in from distant lands: ivory, gold, emeralds, incense, spices, and exotic animals. In return, Aksum exported these goods across the known world. It is said that Roman emperors received Ethiopian elephants for their arenas, and Indian merchants traded with Aksumite caravans under the scorching East African sun. This extensive trade network brought not only prosperity, but also influence. By the 3rd century CE, Aksum was recognized internationally. The Roman scholar Claudius Ptolemy included Aksum in his maps. Inscriptions found in southern Arabia describe Aksumite military interventions. Even coins minted in Aksum bore inscriptions in Greek, the lingua franca of international commerce, and depicted powerful monarchs crowned with regal symbols. Coinage was a hallmark of Aksumite sophistication. Ethiopia was the first African empire, outside of Egypt and Carthage, to mint its own currency, gold, silver, and bronze coins that circulated widely and featured portraits of kings and Christian crosses in later years. These coins weren't just currency, they were a message to the world. Aksum was here, powerful and civilized. One of the greatest rulers of Aksum was King Ezana, who reigned in the 4th century CE. Under his rule, Aksum reached its height in military power, economy, and international prestige. Ezana led successful military campaigns into Nubia and across the Red Sea into southern Arabia, expanding Aksum's influence on both sides of the Red Sea. But Ezana is remembered for more than conquest. He was the first Ethiopian king to convert to Christianity. This monumental shift came around 330 CE, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Constantine, who had just legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire. Influenced by his Syrian Christian tutor Frumentius, Ezana embraced the Christian faith and declared it the state religion of Aksum. Frumentius would go on to become the first bishop of Ethiopia, consecrated by the Patriarch of Alexandria, cementing Ethiopia's place in the Coptic Orthodox world. This moment changed everything. Christianity in Ethiopia was not a foreign transplant. It took root in the local soil, blending with indigenous beliefs and traditions. Churches were built, crosses were carved into stone, and religious manuscripts began to appear in Guizi, the ancient Ethiopian script that still survives in liturgical use today. Aksum became one of the first officially Christian states in the world, long before much of Europe. While many other African civilizations remained animist or later embraced Islam, Ethiopia's deep Christian identity would become both a source of unity and conflict in the centuries to come. The symbols of Aksum's greatness remain to this day. Towering obelisks, some over 20 meters tall, still stand in the ancient city of Aksum. Engineering marvels carved from single pieces of granite. These stelae were grave markers for the royal elite, adorned with false doors and windows, mimicking the architecture of Aksumite palaces. They speak not only of wealth and skill, but also of a people who believed deeply in life after death and the permanence of legacy. However, as with all great powers, Aksum's golden age would not last forever. By the 6th century, shifting trade routes and the rise of Persian and later Islamic control over the Arabian Peninsula disrupted Aksum's dominance in the Red Sea. Its influence in Yemen was lost. The once bustling port of Adulis fell into decline, and with it, the economic engine of the empire stalled. Environmental factors also played a role. Evidence suggests that climate change, particularly long-term drought and soil exhaustion from overfarming, weakened the agricultural base of the kingdom. As prosperity waned, Aksum's political center began to move southward, away from the vulnerable Red Sea coast and deeper into the Ethiopian highlands. By the early 7th century, Aksum had begun to retreat from its imperial glory, yet it never truly vanished. Unlike Rome or Carthage, which fell to invaders and were forgotten for centuries, Aksum evolved. The Christian traditions it embraced were carried forward by new dynasties. Its script, Guizi, remained alive, and though its monuments would crumble, its legacy endured, buried in the consciousness of the Ethiopian people. Even as the Islamic caliphates rose across Arabia and North Africa, Ethiopia held firm in its Christian identity. According to Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad advised his early followers to seek refuge in the land of the just king, a Christian ruler in Abyssinia. This king, known in Arabic as Al-Najashi, is believed to be a reference to an Aksumite monarch, possibly the successor of Ezana. The refugees were welcomed, protected, and allowed to practice their faith freely. This episode forged a unique relationship between early Muslims and Christian Ethiopians, one based on mutual respect rather than conquest. Ethiopia would remain untouched by Islamic expansion for centuries, a Christian kingdom surrounded by Muslim territories, yet retaining its sovereignty and faith. As Aksum's outward reach faded, its spiritual and cultural influence solidified. Now, no longer an empire in the traditional sense, Ethiopia transformed. The focus shifted from expansion and trade to preservation and endurance. The roots planted by Aksum, Christianity, written language, centralized monarchy, would support the next chapter in Ethiopia's history, the rise of the Zagwe dynasty and the continuation of Ethiopian civilization deep in the highlands. But before we leave Aksum behind, we must acknowledge its enduring role in world history. Aksum was one of the four great powers of its time, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. It commanded armies, minted coins, built monuments, and practiced diplomacy across continents. And perhaps most impressively, it did all of this on African soil, rooted in African traditions. Aksum was not a colony. It was not a satellite of some larger empire. It was an African superpower, proud, independent, and deeply spiritual. And though it faded from the global stage, its story was far from over. For as Aksum fell silent, the highlands of Ethiopia began to stir once more, with new rulers, new saints, and new visions of empire. The Zagwe dynasty, stone churches, and sacred kingdoms. As the mighty kingdom of Aksum receded into history, its legacy lived on in the highlands. Though trade slowed and imperial ambitions dimmed, Ethiopia did not collapse into darkness. Instead, a new chapter unfolded, one shaped not by conquest and commerce, but by faith, isolation, and monumental devotion. Between the 7th and 10th centuries, Ethiopia's political structure became more localized. The remnants of Aksumite aristocracy moved inland, retreating from the vulnerable coastlines now dominated by Islamic powers. This period, though murky due to limited written records, saw the gradual rise of smaller Christian principalities who maintained continuity of culture and religion. From this fragmented landscape emerged a new dynasty that would leave a mark unlike any other, the Zagwe dynasty. Centered in the Lasta region, in what is now northern Ethiopia, the Zagwe rulers claimed not only political authority, but also spiritual legitimacy. They portrayed themselves as guardians of the Christian faith, protectors of a sacred tradition passed down from the kings of Aksum. Whether or not they were direct descendants of Aksumite royalty remains debated. What mattered was continuity, the idea that Ethiopian kings ruled by divine right. The Zagwe period lasted from the mid-10th century to the late 13th century, a span of nearly 300 years. But one name towers above all others in this era: King Lalibela. Lalibela was no ordinary monarch. His reign in the 12th to early 13th century became the centerpiece of Ethiopian medieval history. According to tradition, Lalibela was divinely inspired to create a new Jerusalem, a spiritual center for Ethiopian Christianity, safe from the Muslim control of the Holy Land. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem had become dangerous, if not impossible. The solution? Bring Jerusalem to Ethiopia. Thus began one of the most astounding architectural achievements in human history. In the small town that would eventually bear his name, King Lalibela commissioned the construction of 11 monolithic churches, each carved directly out of solid volcanic rock. These were not built with stone, they were carved into it, top down, like sculptures. No mortar, no bricks, just chisel, hammer, and unwavering faith. Each church was unique in design, yet all were linked through tunnels and trenches, forming a sacred complex that mimicked the layout of biblical Jerusalem. The most famous of them, Bet George's Church of St. George, stands in a cruciform shape, hewn into the earth with impossible precision. From above, it resembles a cross-shaped island sunken into the rock, surrounded by perfectly vertical walls. The story goes that angels helped finish the churches after human laborers rested. Whether one believes the legend or not, the craftsmanship seems beyond the scope of the tools available at the time. Even modern engineers are baffled by how these structures were completed, without scaffolding, modern machinery, or advanced surveying instruments. But the Zagwe era was not just about architecture. It was a time of devotional consolidation. The Christian church became deeply woven into the state. Monasteries flourished. Manuscript production increased. Ancient texts, prayers, and religious chants were preserved in Guizi, the liturgical language of Ethiopian Christianity. A rich tradition of religious iconography emerged. Vibrant paintings of saints, angels, and biblical scenes adorned church walls and manuscripts. This period also solidified Ethiopia's identity as a Christian kingdom set apart, surrounded by Islamic territories, but maintaining its own sacred rhythm. In some ways, the Zagwe dynasty turned inward, focusing more on spiritual endurance than geopolitical expansion. But this inward focus did not mean stagnation. It allowed for the deep entrenchment of Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity as a defining feature of the nation's soul. At the same time, contact with the outside world was never entirely severed. Ethiopian monks are known to have traveled to Egypt and Jerusalem. The Ethiopian Church maintained its ties with the Coptic Church of Alexandria, whose patriarch continued to appoint the Abuna, the head of the Ethiopian Church. This spiritual connection bridged the Red Sea, even as political and commercial ties faded. However, despite the religious grandeur and artistic flourishing, the Zagwe dynasty was not immune to internal strife. Questions about its legitimacy lingered. The Zagwe were perceived by some as usurpers, having replaced the Solomonic line, the supposed descendants of King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba. According to Ethiopian tradition, detailed centuries later in the Cradle of Humanity, the Queen of Sheba, known as Makeda in Ethiopian lore, traveled to Jerusalem to visit King Solomon. From their union came a son, Menelik I, the legendary founder of Ethiopia's Solomonic dynasty. It was believed that Menelik brought the Ark of the Covenant back to Ethiopia, where it still supposedly rests today in Aksum, guarded and unseen. Though the Cradle of Humanity was compiled after the Zagwe period, this legend had already begun to take hold. The idea that Ethiopia's true kings were of Solomonic blood became increasingly powerful and politically explosive. By the late 13th century, discontent with the Zagwe's rule intensified. Regional nobles, especially from the Amhara and Shoa regions, rallied behind a prince named Yakuno Amlak, who claimed descent from the ancient Solomonic line. In a swift campaign, he overthrew the Zagwe rulers in 1270 and re-established the Solomonic dynasty, a lineage that would endure, in one form or another, for nearly 700 years. With Yakuno Amlak's rise, a new chapter began, one that would blend the spiritual legacy of the Zagwe with a renewed focus on kingship, expansion, and imperial power. The center of gravity shifted again, but the memory of Lalibela and his stone churches remained. Even today, those churches are still used. Pilgrims from all corners of Ethiopia, and even from abroad, descend into the sacred earth to pray, sing, and celebrate their connection to a past carved in stone. The Zagwe dynasty may have fallen politically, but spiritually it never ended. As the Solomonic emperors began their long reign, they inherited not only a kingdom, but a sacred duty to uphold the divine lineage, guard the Christian faith, and keep Ethiopia's unique identity alive in a world growing ever more interconnected and hostile. And soon, these new kings would have to prove their strength. For what lay ahead was not peace, but centuries of dynastic rivalries, holy wars, and encounters with the powerful empires of the wider world. The Solomonic dynasty, empire, legends, and holy wars. The year was 1270. The Zagwe dynasty had been overthrown. Yakuno Amlak, a young prince claiming descent from the ancient line of Menelik I, son of Solomon, and the Queen of Sheba, ascended the throne. This moment was more than a mere change in rulers. It was a return to divine legitimacy, or so the chronicles claimed. A lost lineage restored, a promise fulfilled. The Solomonic dynasty would become one of the longest ruling royal houses in world history. Its kings traced their ancestry not merely to earthly kings, but to King Solomon himself, giving their authority an unshakable theological foundation. This claim, rooted in the Cradle of Humanity, the glory of kings, would shape Ethiopian identity for centuries. The Cradle of Humanity, compiled in the 14th century, was part myth, part national epic, and entirely political. It described how Queen Makeda of Sheba traveled to Jerusalem, bore a son by Solomon, and that son, Menelik I, returned to Ethiopia carrying the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark, according to the text, was not just a relic. It was the ultimate sign of divine favor, a vessel of God's law, now protected on Ethiopian soil. This claim was bold. No other Christian kingdom on earth claimed to possess the Arkansas. It gave Ethiopian monarchs a sacred aura unmatched by their rivals. They were not just rulers, they were guardians of God's covenant. But legitimacy alone wasn't enough. Yakuno Amlak and his successors had to consolidate power. The early Solomonic emperors faced rebellions from local lords, border incursions, and religious tensions. Yet they also began to rebuild the Ethiopian state, reviving trade, reforming the church, and reasserting control over a fragmented land. One of the defining features of the Solomonic period was the restoration of imperial ideology. The emperors styled themselves as the Nagusa Nagast, the King of Kings, ruling over a multi-ethnic, multilingual empire. Their courts were mobile, moving across the highlands, dispensing justice, collecting tribute, and inspecting the lands they ruled. The empire expanded, absorbing new provinces and pushing against rival Muslim sultanates in the east. The highlands of Amhara, Tigray, and Shoa became imperial heartlands, while outlying regions were brought under loose vassalage. But the Solomonic rulers were not content to merely reign. They envisioned Ethiopia as a holy kingdom, a second Jerusalem, ordained to uphold Christianity in a region increasingly dominated by Islam. By the 14th century, this vision clashed violently with its neighbors. To the east, the Sultanate of Ifit, a powerful Muslim polity, challenged the empire's borders. Its rulers, descended from the Walashma dynasty, engaged in decades of warfare with the Christian Highland kings. Religious difference fueled political rivalry. The Ethiopian emperors saw the Muslim sultanates as threats to the Christian order. The sultans saw the empire as a Christian aggressor encroaching on their autonomy. One of the most pivotal kings during this time was Amdseyin I, who ruled from 1314 to 1344. A warrior king with uncompromising zeal, Amdseyin waged relentless campaigns against Ifit and its allies. He crushed rebellions, reasserted central authority, and pushed Ethiopia's borders deep into the lowlands and the southeast. His victories were recorded in royal chronicles written in Guizi, powerful accounts that blended history, scripture, and prophecy. Under Amdseyin, Ethiopia became a truly imperial Christian state. He established strong ties with the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, patronized monasteries, and supported religious scholars. His reign set the tone for Ethiopia's identity, not just a nation, but a chosen kingdom, besieged by enemies, yet protected by faith. However, this expansion came at a cost. The empire's Muslim neighbors became more entrenched, and bitterness hardened on both sides. Conflict was not only military, it became theological. To counter Muslim influence, the emperors encouraged the construction of churches, the spread of monasticism, and the publication of sacred texts. Ethiopian Christianity developed its own distinct theology and practices, incorporating fasting rituals, liturgical music, and even elements of pre-Christian traditions. The empire's spiritual and cultural life flourished, even as war loomed on the horizon. By the 15th century, the Solomonic dynasty was firmly established, but cracks began to show. Internal divisions, succession disputes, and ongoing border wars weakened imperial control. Still, Ethiopia's fame had spread beyond Africa. In Europe, whispers of a powerful Christian kingdom in the heart of Africa captivated the imagination. Stories circulated about a mysterious monarch known as Prester John, a Christian ruler said to dwell in a distant land, fighting Muslim enemies and guarding sacred relics. For a time, many in Europe believed that Ethiopia was the land of Prester John. Maps were drawn, letters were sent, alliances were hoped for, and those hopes were not entirely in vain. In the early 1400s, Ethiopia made direct diplomatic contact with Europe for the first time. Ambassadors were exchanged between the Ethiopian court and kingdoms like Aragon, Portugal, and the Papal States. In 1441, Ethiopian envoys appeared at the Council of Florence, astonishing the European clergy with their deep Christian knowledge and unique traditions. Ethiopia was no longer a myth. It was a real Christian power, enduring and independent in a world increasingly divided by religious boundaries. But the coming century would test that independence like never before. A new power was rising in the east, the Adal Sultanate, with its capital in Harar. From this region would emerge a military genius and a religious firebrand, Imam Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, known to Ethiopians as Ahmed Gragn or Ahmed the Left-Handed. His jihad would shake Ethiopia to its core. Meanwhile, across the sea, a European power was preparing to act. Portugal, eager to find allies against the Ottomans and spread its influence along the Red Sea, would soon enter Ethiopian history, not as merchants, but as soldiers. The stage was set for one of the most violent and transformative chapters in Ethiopian history, a struggle for survival, identity, and sovereignty. Jihad and fire, Ahmed Gragne, Portugal, and Ethiopia's struggle for survival. As the 16th century dawned, the Ethiopian Empire stood proud, but increasingly vulnerable. The Christian Solomonic dynasty had ruled for centuries, holding firm against internal rebellions and external threats. But the eastern frontier was restless. There, in the arid lands of the Horn, a new Islamic power was rising, the Adal Sultanate, based in Harar. Its ruler, Imam Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, would soon lead a campaign that threatened to erase Christian Ethiopia from the map. Known in Ethiopian tradition as Ahmed Gragne or Ahmed the Left-Handed, he was no ordinary warlord. He was a military commander with unmatched discipline and strategy, and a religious reformer determined to bring Islamic rule to the Christian highlands. Inspired by the wider wave of Islamic revival and bolstered by Ottoman support, Ahmed Gragne launched a full-scale jihad against the Ethiopian Empire in 1529. This was not a border skirmish. It was a war of annihilation. Gragne's armies, armed with matchlock firearms supplied by the Ottomans, had a technological edge over the Ethiopian troops, who still relied largely on traditional swords, lances, and bows. Battle after battle, his forces advanced deep into the highlands, burning churches, destroying manuscripts, and razing monasteries that had stood for centuries. The Ethiopian emperor at the time, Lebna Dengel, was caught off guard. His forces were unprepared for such a brutal and well-armed enemy. Province after province fell. The cultural and religious heart of Ethiopia, centuries of Christian heritage, was under siege. By the early 1530s, half the empire had been overrun. Desperate, the emperor sent envoys across the Red Sea, pleading for help from Portugal, a rising European naval power that had recently established strongholds along the coasts of India, Arabia, and East Africa. The Portuguese, who were seeking allies against the expanding Ottoman Empire, responded. In 1541, a small Portuguese expeditionary force of around 400 musketeers landed at the Red Sea port of Massawa and joined the remnants of the Ethiopian army. They were led by a brave and seasoned commander, Cristóvão da Gama, son of the famous explorer Vasco da Gama. This was more than a political alliance. It was a clash of civilizations, a last stand for an ancient Christian empire. Initially, the Portuguese-Ethiopian alliance struggled to coordinate. Cultural differences and language barriers complicated tactics. But with time, the alliance began to make gains. Da Gama's musketeers, though small in number, had powerful firepower that could check Gragne's dominance on the battlefield. Yet disaster struck when Gragne ambushed Da Gama's forces near Wafla. The Portuguese were defeated, and Cristóvão da Gama was captured, tortured, and executed. His death was a blow, but not the end. Ethiopia, even in its darkest hour, refused to fall. The young Emperor Gelidas, son of Lebna Dengel, rallied his remaining forces. In 1543, at the decisive Battle of Wainadaga, near Lake Tana, the tides turned. Ahmed Gragne was killed in combat, his body pierced by a spear during the final charge. The shock of his death shattered the Adal forces. Without their charismatic and ruthless leader, the jihad collapsed. The invaders retreated, and the Christian highlands were reclaimed. Ethiopia had survived, but the scars were deep. The war had left churches in ruins, priceless manuscripts lost, and countless lives destroyed. Much of the cultural heritage painstakingly built since the time of Lalibela and Amdassayan had been reduced to ashes. Though the empire had been saved, it was forever changed. In the aftermath, Ethiopia attempted to rebuild. Emperor Gelidas, now a national hero, reasserted the authority of the Solomonic throne and restored key churches and monasteries. Yet beneath the surface, new tensions were brewing, this time not from Islam, but from within Christianity itself. The Portuguese, while crucial in saving Ethiopia, did not come without their own agenda. Their Jesuit priests, following in the wake of the soldiers, began preaching Catholicism to the Ethiopian people. At first, this was tolerated, even welcomed by some. But over time, friction grew between the ancient Ethiopian Orthodox Church and the foreign Catholic missionaries. The Ethiopians had their own canon, their own rites, and their own theology, developed over a millennium of isolation. The Portuguese clergy saw it as backward. They sought to convert Ethiopia to Roman Catholicism under the Pope. The Ethiopians resisted fiercely. This spiritual struggle would explode in the century to come as emperors tried and failed to enforce Catholicism. The fallout would plunge the empire into civil strife and bring down emperors. But for now, Ethiopia focused on healing. The 16th century had tested Ethiopia as no other era had. It had survived holy war, foreign invasion, and internal dislocation. Yet through it all, the Solomonic line endured, and with it, the idea of a Christian empire in Africa, stubborn, unbroken, and eternal. But the coming years would not bring peace. New emperors would rise, some weak, others tyrannical. The balance between church and state would tip dangerously, and the power of the nobility, long suppressed, would begin to spiral out of control. What followed was not a golden age, but an era of fragmentation, religious upheaval, and the fading of centralized rule. Cross and crown, the Jesuits, civil unrest, and the fall into chaos. The victory over Ahmed Gragn in 1543 had preserved Ethiopia's Christian identity, but it came at a heavy cost. The land was scorched, its churches burned, and its population depleted. The empire was weakened, not only in power, but in spirit. And into this wounded land stepped new actors, ones whose weapons were not swords or spears, but sermons and doctrine. The Portuguese, who had helped defeat Gragn, remained, but they were no longer represented by musketeers. Now they arrived in the robes of the Jesuits, the most disciplined and ambitious missionaries of the Catholic world. They saw Ethiopia not just as a Christian nation, but as a theological anomaly, a kingdom of believers isolated for centuries, with their own canon of scripture, their own rites, their own saints and sacred traditions. To the Jesuits, this wasn't ancient, it was heretical, and they were determined to fix it. At first, their influence was limited. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church was deeply entrenched in both the faith and the political structure of the empire. But over time, the Jesuits began to gain favor in the royal court, particularly with Emperor Susenyos, who ascended to the throne in 1606. Susenyos was a brilliant and ambitious ruler. He had seen the growing power of Catholic Europe and likely hoped that embracing Catholicism would bring military aid, trade, and modernization. And so in 1622, in a dramatic and fateful move, he converted to Roman Catholicism and declared it the official religion of the empire. The shock was seismic. For nearly 1,000 years, Ethiopia had practiced its own version of Christianity, Coptic in origin, but uniquely Ethiopian in form. To many Ethiopians, this was not just faith, it was national identity. The idea of abandoning it for a foreign creed, with foreign priests and foreign rites, was unthinkable. When Jesuit missionaries began ordering the destruction of ancient liturgical books, banning traditional fasting practices, and enforcing Latin Mass, resistance turned into rebellion. Entire provinces erupted in revolt. Monks fled to the mountains. Nobles turned their swords not against invaders, but against their own king. Susenyos, in the name of religious unity, unleashed brutal campaigns to enforce Catholicism. His soldiers slaughtered thousands. Blood was spilled not in the name of conquest, but of the cross. But it was all in vain. The empire was tearing itself apart. Finally, in 1632, recognizing that his kingdom would not survive under Catholic rule, Susenyos abdicated the throne in favor of his son, Fasilides, who immediately reversed course. He restored the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, expelled the Jesuits, and formally severed ties with the Roman papacy. From this point on, Ethiopia would remain proudly Orthodox and deeply wary of foreign missionaries. The Portuguese alliance that had once saved the empire had now nearly destroyed it from within. Emperor Fasilides took a defensive turn. He moved the imperial capital to Gondar, a city he built anew, complete with castles, palaces, and churches. It was modeled in part on foreign architecture, Portuguese and Indian elements blended with Ethiopian tradition, but it represented a distinctly Ethiopian renaissance. For a time, Gondar became a vibrant center of art, theology, and royal ceremony. The Gondarine period, spanning from the mid-1600s to the early 1700s, gave Ethiopia a moment of relative peace. Emperors patronized painters, scholars, and priests. The walls of churches were adorned with iconic religious frescoes, some of which survive to this day. Chronicles were written. Chronicles were preserved. The city was alive with color and culture. But beneath the surface, power was shifting. The Ethiopian emperors, once the unquestioned rulers of a centralized Christian empire, began to lose control over their increasingly powerful provincial lords. Noble families in regions like Tigray, Gajam, and Begemder amassed wealth and troops of their own. Local rulers, called Raises, began acting like kings in all but name, collecting taxes, waging wars, and even installing or removing emperors. The monarchy became increasingly symbolic, a pawn manipulated by regional strongmen. This slow erosion of central authority culminated in what is known as the Zemin Mesafint, the era of the princes. This period, beginning in the late 1700s and lasting into the mid-19th century, was one of decentralization and fragmentation. Ethiopia was no longer a united empire, but a patchwork of warring fiefdoms, each ruled by a ras or a warlord. The emperor still existed, enthroned in Gondar, but held little real power. In many cases, he was a figurehead under the control of the most dominant noble of the time. The Zemin Mesafint was marked by constant power struggles, shifting alliances, and intermittent civil wars. Battles were fought not just between Christians and Muslims, but between rival Orthodox lords. Provinces would rise and fall with dizzying speed. Fortunes changed overnight. But even in this era of turmoil, the flame of Ethiopia never died. The Ethiopian church remained resilient. Monasteries in the highlands continued to teach, copy scriptures, and resist foreign influence. The people clung to their ancient traditions, passed from father to son, mother to daughter, generation to generation. The Solomonic dynasty, incredibly, was never abolished. Through coups and chaos, a line of emperors continued, diminished, yes, but unbroken. The dream of a united Christian empire still lingered in the hearts of the people. And one day, that dream would awaken. Indeed, from the ashes of civil war and regional division, a new kind of leader would rise, not a king by birthright, but a warrior by merit. A man who would reunite the kingdom by sword and fire, who would tame the princes and reforge the crown. His name was Haile, but history would remember him as Tawadros II. Tawadros II, reunifying the empire and awakening a new Ethiopia. By the mid-19th century, Ethiopia had been splintered for nearly a century. The Zemin Mesafint, or era of the princes, had turned the once mighty empire into a battlefield of rival lords. The emperor was little more than a puppet, seated in Gondar, but controlled by whichever warlord held the balance of power. But in the fog of civil war and the fading memory of Solomonic glory, a new figure rose, not from noble lineage, but from grit, ambition, and a vision of rebirth. His name was Haile. Born around 1818 in Kwara, western Ethiopia, Kassa came from modest beginnings. His father was a minor noble, but Kassa was no prince. He grew up witnessing the fragmentation of Ethiopia, provinces fighting one another, emperors overthrown and restored like chess pieces, and foreign powers beginning to peer hungrily toward the highlands. Kassa believed in something radical for his time, a strong, unified Ethiopia under a single, centralized crown. A nation not just preserved by tradition, but propelled forward by reform, education, and military strength. Through charisma and battlefield brilliance, Kassa carved out his own territory. He defeated rival lords, outmaneuvered the most powerful nobles of the Zemin Mesafint, and gained a reputation as a warrior statesman. By 1855, after a string of victories, Kassa marched into Gondar, was crowned emperor, and took the throne name Tawadros II. With that, The Zeme Mesophint was declared over. The Solomonic Empire, in spirit if not yet in strength, was reborn. But Tawadros was no ordinary emperor. He was not interested in ceremony. He wanted transformation. He envisioned an Ethiopia free from foreign influence, with roads, schools, printing presses, and a modern army. He built cannons and imported European blacksmiths and engineers. He sought to reduce the power of the church and nobility, centralize tax collection, and draft a professional standing army. Yet, the very changes that made Tawadros a visionary also made him dangerous to those who profited from the old order. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, still powerful, resisted his attempts to curb its land and privilege. The nobles he had once fought grew restless under the weight of his reforms. Even the people, proud but poor, struggled to adjust to his heavy taxes and conscriptions. At the same time, Tawadros began reaching out to the outside world, not as a supplicant, but as a sovereign. He wrote to Queen Victoria of Britain, asking for diplomatic relations and assistance with modernizing Ethiopia. But his letters were ignored or mishandled by colonial bureaucrats who saw little value in Africa beyond resources and routes. Feeling insulted and betrayed, Tawadros took a drastic and fatal step. He imprisoned British envoys who had failed to deliver a response from a queen. This triggered a crisis. In 1868, the British launched a massive military expedition to free the hostages, the Abyssinian Expedition, led by Sir Robert Napier. Over 13,000 troops, accompanied by elephants, artillery, and thousands of porters, marched into Ethiopia from the Red Sea coast, armed with the most advanced weaponry of the day. Tawadros, realizing the scale of what he had provoked, prepared for a final stand. He retreated to the mountain fortress of Magdala, taking his family and loyal followers with him. As the British forces ascended the cliffs and surrounded the stronghold, the once proud emperor faced defeat. Rather than surrender to foreign invaders, Tawadros too took his own life with a pistol, ironically, a gift he had once received from the British. His death marked a tragic end to a reign that had promised so much. Tawadros had tried to rebuild Ethiopia from its ashes, but his dream was crushed by resistance at home and misunderstanding abroad. Yet his legacy would not be forgotten. Though Tawadros died a broken man, he had reawakened the idea of a unified Ethiopia. He had proved that even after centuries of fragmentation, the empire could rise again. His reign, short and tumultuous, lit a fire in the hearts of those who would follow. The years after Tawadros' death saw new power struggles, but his vision persisted. The empire did not fall apart. Instead, new leaders emerged, each taking the torch of unification and reform further than the last. Among them was a nobleman named Kassa Mercha, who would rise as Emperor Johannes for a devout Christian and fierce defender of the highlands. The 19th century was not finished with Ethiopia. More storms were gathering, both internal and external. The Ottoman Turks, the Egyptians, the Mahdists of Sudan, and the looming threat of European colonialism would all test the resilience of the Ethiopian state. But the seeds planted by Tawadros, unity, modernity, sovereignty, had taken root. Ethiopia had been jolted out of stagnation. The age of the princes was truly over. What lay ahead was an empire once again on the offensive, ready to defend its sovereignty with fire and sword. And soon, a new emperor would rise, one whose name would echo across Africa and the world. A man destined to stand before the might of European imperialism, defy it, and win. His name was Menelik II. Menelik II, the Battle of Adwa and the defiance of an empire. The fires lit by Tawadros II did not die with him, though his reign ended in tragedy. His dream of a strong, unified Ethiopia refused to fade. From his ashes rose other leaders who would continue his mission. Among them, one stood above all, a tactician, a diplomat, and a visionary, Emperor Menelik II. Born in 1844, Salamarium of Shua would rise through the ranks of nobility during a time of shifting alliances and dangerous politics. As the ruler of Shua, a powerful and wealthy southern province, he watched the empire convulse after Tawadros' fall, then shift again under Emperor Johannes IV. Yohannes, a Tigrayan noble, was a devout Orthodox Christian and a military emperor. He fought against foreign threats on all sides, the Egyptians to the north, the Mahdists from Sudan, and expanding European interests along the coast. He maintained Ethiopia's independence, but his reign was cut short when he fell in battle in 1889, fighting the Mahdists at Metemmeh. Into that power vacuum stepped Menelik. Though he had sworn fealty to Yohannes, Menelik had spent years preparing, consolidating Shua, modernizing his army, and building diplomatic ties. After Yohannes' death, he moved quickly, gaining support from the church and key nobles. He was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia in the same year, taking the name Menelik II, invoking the legendary son of Solomon and Sheba. But Menelik's Ethiopia was not just myth and ritual. It was practical, strategic, and hungry for modernization. He imported weapons, telegraphs, and printing presses. He built roads and invited European artisans and military experts to train his forces. He began issuing silver coins, centralizing the economy, and expanding Ethiopian territory southward, incorporating Oromo, Sidama, and Somali regions into the empire, creating the rough shape of modern Ethiopia. Yet all of this was overshadowed by a growing storm: European colonialism. By the late 19th century, the scramble for Africa was at full speed. France, Britain, and Germany carved up territories with impunity. Italy, late to the game, looked toward the Horn of Africa. Having already occupied Eritrea on the Red Sea coast, they saw Ethiopia fragmented, tribal, and primitive in their eyes, as ripe for colonization. But they miscalculated. In 1889, Menelik signed the Treaty of Wuchel with the Italians. In the Amharic version, it was a simple agreement of friendship and trade. But in the Italian version, Article 17 was twisted to imply that Ethiopia had become an Italian protectorate, giving Rome authority over Ethiopia's foreign affairs. When Menelik discovered the deception, he was furious. He rejected the treaty, denounced the Italian interpretation, and began preparing for war. Italy, blinded by imperial arrogance, assumed Menelik would fold under pressure. They readied an invasion to enforce their claim. What followed was one of the most defining moments in African history. In 1896, the two sides met in the rugged mountains of northern Ethiopia, near a small town called Adwa. The Italians fielded around 18,000 troops, equipped with modern artillery and European officers. But Menelik had over 100,000 Ethiopians, including warriors from across the empire, Amhara, Tigrayans, Oromos, and more, united in defense of their land. They were not a disorganized tribal horde, as the Europeans believed. They were well-led, well-armed, thanks to Menelik's years of preparation, and motivated by something no foreign power could buy: freedom. On the morning of March 1, 1896, the Italians marched into a trap. Menelik's generals, including his brilliant wife, Empress Teta Batul, who commanded forces of her own, had positioned their troops perfectly in the mountain passes. The terrain was unforgiving, and the Ethiopians knew it better than anyone. By mid-morning, the Italian columns had been separated, encircled, and crushed. It was not just a victory, it was a rout. Thousands of Italian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The survivors fled back to Eritrea in chaos. Ethiopia had not merely resisted colonization, it had defeated a European imperial army in open battle. The shockwaves were felt across the globe. In Africa, Adwa became a beacon of hope, proof that European domination was not inevitable. Across the Black diaspora, it inspired movements for dignity and independence. In Harlem, in the Caribbean, in South Africa, the name Menelik became a symbol of pride. In Europe, it was an embarrassment. Italy was forced to recognize Ethiopia's sovereignty through the Treaty of Addis Ababa. Menelik's victory secured the empire's borders and its independence for another generation. But Menelik was not content with just surviving. After Adwa, he doubled down on modernization. He founded Addis Ababa as the new capital, oversaw the construction of roads and telegraph lines, opened schools, and sought to integrate Ethiopia's diverse populations under a central authority. Still, challenges remained. Though victorious, Ethiopia faced tensions between its Christian highland core and newly incorporated southern peoples, who had been brought under imperial rule by force. Menelik also faced resistance from conservative elements of the church and aristocracy, who feared his reforms. And like his predecessors, he had to balance modernization with Ethiopia's deeply religious, traditional character. By the time of his death in 1913, Menelik II had not only defended Ethiopia, he had reshaped it. He had shown that Africa was not a passive victim of imperialism, but a continent of civilizations that could adapt, resist, and triumph. Under his rule, Ethiopia became the only African nation to preserve its independence during the height of European colonialism. But with Menelik's death, uncertainty returned. Succession crises, foreign pressure, and the shadows of modern warfare loomed on the horizon. The world was changing rapidly. Europe was hurtling toward the First World War. Empires would fall, new ideologies would rise, and Ethiopia would soon find itself facing a new wave of invasion, this time from fascist Italy, more brutal and vengeful than before. And out of that chaos, another towering figure would rise, a Lion of Judah, a voice of Africa, and a symbol of resistance across the globe. Haile Selassie I. Haile Selassie, Lion of Judah, Emperor of modern Africa. Following the death of Menelik II in 1913, Ethiopia faced a power vacuum. Though Menelik had built a legacy of unity and modernization, he left no strong heir. His grandson Lige Ayasu was named successor, but his rule was short-lived, controversial, and ultimately uncrowned. Ayasu's perceived leniency toward Islam and his open diplomatic flirtation with the Central Powers during World War I alarmed Ethiopia's Christian nobility and clergy. In 1916, he was deposed in a palace coup, and Zuditu, Menelik's daughter, was declared empress, the first and only woman to officially rule Ethiopia in the modern era. But power behind the throne was already shifting to a rising figure, a young nobleman named Tafari Makonnen. Born in 1892 to a noble Oromo mother and a Christian Amhara father, Tafari was fluent in multiple languages, educated, and politically astute. In 1917, he was appointed regent plenipotentiary, and over the next decade, he gradually consolidated power, modernized the state, and built a reputation as a reformer and a bridge between Ethiopia and the outside world. In 1930, after Empress Zudita's death, Tafari was crowned Emperor Haile Selassie I, taking the ancient title King of Kings, elect of God, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah. His coronation was a global event. Representatives from Europe, the United States, and the Middle East came to witness it. Ethiopia, though ancient, was now stepping boldly into the modern era. Haile Selassie quickly moved to modernize Ethiopia's institutions. He introduced a written constitution in 1931, the first in Ethiopian history, which limited noble power, centralized the monarchy, and established a semblance of parliamentary rule. He built schools, reformed the military, and worked to modernize agriculture and infrastructure. But Ethiopia's independence and transformation posed a threat to the ambitions of Europe's fascist powers, particularly Italy, still nursing humiliation from its defeat at Adwa in 1896. Under the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini, Italy sought revenge and expansion. In 1935, using a border incident as a pretext, Mussolini launched a full-scale invasion of Ethiopia. A brutal campaign backed by modern tanks, aircraft, and chemical weapons, including poison gas. The Italian military bombed civilians, destroyed infrastructure, and attempted to break the spirit of the Ethiopian resistance. Haile Selassie's forces, though courageous, were outgunned. After months of fierce resistance, Addis Ababa fell in May 1936. But Haile Selassie did not surrender. He fled to Geneva, where he addressed the League of Nations in one of the most powerful speeches of the 20th century. Standing before a world unwilling to act, he pleaded, "God and history will remember your judgment. It is us today. It will be you tomorrow." The world watched and did little. The League condemned Italy's invasion, but sanctions were weak, and Mussolini's fascist empire was briefly triumphant. For 5 years, Ethiopia endured occupation. Italians attempted to dismantle Ethiopian culture, rewrite its history, and replace it with fascist ideology. Monasteries were raided. Intellectuals were executed. Resistance was brutally suppressed. But the Ethiopian people never gave in. Guerrilla fighters, known as Arbanyak or Patriots, harassed Italian supply lines and assassinated collaborators. Underground networks formed. The spirit of Menelik and Tewodros lived on in every mountain ambush and whispered prayer. Then came World War II. When Italy entered the war in 1940 on the side of Nazi Germany, Britain saw an opportunity to strike Mussolini's East African holdings. With the backing of British Commonwealth forces, Ethiopian patriots launched a massive counteroffensive. In 1941, Haile Selassie returned to Ethiopia, re-entering Addis Ababa in triumph. His people lined the streets in tears. The emperor, who had once walked into exile with no allies, now returned at the head of a liberation army. Ethiopia was the only African nation occupied by a European power to regain its independence through war. And it did so not by foreign mercy, but through armed resistance and global diplomacy. In the post-war years, Haile Selassie emerged as a symbol of African dignity. He was revered not just at home, but across the continent and beyond. In Jamaica, a spiritual movement had long seen him as the living God, the Messiah foretold by Marcus Garvey. These followers, the Rastafarians, took their name from Haile Selassie's pre-coronation title, Rastafari. Selassie himself never claimed divinity. He remained a deeply devout Orthodox Christian, but he respected the Rastafarian community and welcomed their leaders to Ethiopia. Back home, the emperor resumed his mission of reform. He established Haile Selassie University, built hospitals, and pushed for land reform and education. He abolished slavery completely in Ethiopia, a practice still lingering in remote regions, and oversaw the founding of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in Addis Ababa in 1963, making Ethiopia the diplomatic capital of Africa. He was called the father of modern Africa, a voice of Pan-Africanism who insisted that Africans must write their own future. Yet, beneath the praise, trouble was brewing. The global post-colonial world was changing rapidly. Youth movements, Marxist ideas, and demands for equality were rising. Ethiopia, though independent, remained deeply feudal. The nobility still held vast estates. Many Ethiopians, particularly in the south, lived in poverty. Famine and inequality bred frustration. As the 1970s dawned, a new storm was coming, not from outside, but from within. The last emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, would soon face his greatest challenge, a revolution, born from hunger, discontent, and the cry for justice. Revolution, war, and the rise of a new Ethiopia. By the early 1970s, Ethiopia stood at a crossroads. On the surface, the empire still glittered. Emperor Haile Selassie, now in his 80s, was a towering global figure. His statues stood in African capitals. He had survived fascism, World War, and the colonial scramble. But within Ethiopia, the sheen was wearing thin. The empire was deeply unequal. While Addis Ababa flourished, rural Ethiopia remained mired in poverty and feudalism. Vast estates were controlled by a handful of landlords. Peasants lived under a heavy tax burden. The dream of reform had stalled. Then, in 1973, famine struck. In the provinces of Wallo and Tigray, hundreds of thousands starved. The imperial government tried to hide the scale of the disaster, but journalists exposed the truth. Discontent exploded. Students protested. Teachers organized. Soldiers, unpaid and ignored, began to whisper of mutiny. And in 1974, the unthinkable happened. A group of military officers, calling themselves the Derg, meaning committee, seized power. Haile Selassie was deposed, placed under house arrest, and the 3,000-year-old monarchy came to an end. He died a year later under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was natural causes, but many believe he was murdered, suffocated in his bed by his captors. The Lion of Judah was gone. The Derg, under the leadership of Mengistu Haile Mariam, declared Ethiopia a Marxist-Leninist state. Statues of emperors were torn down. Land was nationalized. Revolutionary slogans echoed through the streets. They promised justice, equality, a workers' state. But what followed was a reign of terror and repression. The Red Terror campaign, launched in 1977, saw tens of thousands of perceived political opponents, students, intellectuals, clergy, arrested, tortured, and executed. Corpses lined the streets of Addis Ababa. Families were too afraid to claim the bodies. Meanwhile, Ethiopia descended into war on multiple fronts. To the east, Somalia invaded the Ogaden region in 1977, sparking a brutal conflict. To the north, the province of Eritrea continued its decades-long fight for independence. In Tigray and Amhara, resistance groups rose against the Derg's brutality. The country fractured under the weight of military dictatorship, famine, and war. Then, in the mid-1980s, Ethiopia was struck again by devastating famine, this time on a scale the world could not ignore. Images of emaciated children and hollow-eyed mothers filled television screens. The famine of 1983 to 1985 killed over 1 million people. Global outrage followed. Aid poured in. Celebrities held concerts. But behind the scenes, the Derg manipulated food supplies as a weapon of war, withholding aid from rebel regions and forcibly resettling entire populations. The Derg, once heralded as revolutionary, had become a pariah. Finally, in 1991, after nearly 2 decades of rule, the Derg was overthrown by a coalition of rebel forces, most notably the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, TPLF, and the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, EPLF. Mengistu fled to Zimbabwe, where he remains in exile to this day. With the fall of the Derg, Eritrea declared independence in 1993, breaking away after a bloody 30-year war. Ethiopia, landlocked for the first time in history, began the difficult process of rebuilding. In 1995, a new constitution was adopted. Ethiopia became the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, structured around a multi-ethnic federalism, allowing regions self-rule based on ethnicity and language. For the next 2 decades, the country saw economic growth, major infrastructure projects, and rising regional influence. Addis Ababa became the headquarters of the African Union, and Ethiopia emerged as a stabilizing force in East Africa. But the ethnic federal system also sowed new divisions, tensions between groups, particularly between the Tigrayans, Oromos, and Amharas, simmered beneath the surface. In 2018, a young reformist named Abiy Ahmed became prime minister. He promised unity, peace, and reform. In 2019, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for ending the decades-long state of war with Eritrea. But peace would not last. In 2020, civil war broke out in Tigray, pitting the federal government against the TPLF, former liberators turned rivals. The conflict devastated northern Ethiopia. Reports of atrocities, mass displacements, and humanitarian crises drew global concern. Even as peace talks emerged, the road ahead remained uncertain. Yet through it all, Ethiopia endures. A land with more than 80 ethnic groups, over 90 languages, and a culture that stretches from the Aksumite obelisks to modern tech hubs. Ethiopia is not just a country. It is a civilizational force. It was never colonized. It shaped its own destiny. It gave the world coffee, script, music, emperors, and revolutionaries. It inspired Pan-Africanism, resisted fascism, and stood tall when others fell. It is a land of faith, fire, and resilience. Outro. From the ancient rise of DMT and Aksum to the legends of Solomon and Sheba, through centuries of faith, conquest, and resistance, Ethiopia's story is unlike any other. It is the only African empire to defeat colonial invaders in open battle. The only nation on the continent to maintain continuous sovereignty through centuries of foreign conquest. Ethiopia is not just where civilization once bloomed. It is where it still burns with life. A land of kings and queens, of prophets and patriots, of stone-hewn churches and blood-won freedom. This is Ethiopia, the land we all came from, and the land that never bowed.